Central Florida's critical connection between water quality and quantity. You're listening to The Wrap from Central Florida Public Media. I'm Brendan Byrne. It's been just over 1 month since Hurricane Milton devastated parts of Central Florida with record or near-record amounts of rain. As severe storms bring increasingly more rainfall to Central Florida, flooding remains a top concern. As part of our continued coverage of that flooding with our podcast, Central Florida Seen and Heard Rising Water Part 2, we dive into the story about how flooding often creates other concerns, like contamination from wastewater. The connection between water quality and water quantity, that's ahead on The Wrap. The big stories this week from Central Florida Public Media. But first, these news headlines. Florida lawmakers are joining the Trump administration. President-elect Donald Trump nominated U.S. Senator Marco Rubio to Secretary of State. Central Florida Congressman Mike Waltz has been asked to serve as National Security Advisor, and North Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz has been tapped for Trump's Attorney General. Central Florida Public Media reporter Joe Mario Pedersen tells us what happens to those Florida legislative seats when those lawmakers vacate them to serve the administration.
Marco Rubio's vacated Senate seat replacement would be selected by Governor Ron DeSantis. Patrick Rickert, a political science professor at Rollins College, says the governor could choose anyone he best thinks fits the seat strategically. As for Walt's congressional seat, that would be replaced through a special election soon after the seat empties. Rickert says that Trump's move to appoint a Florida representative is a wise one.
From a strategic standpoint for the Trump administration to do so, because Florida seats, at least in the House of Representatives and the Senate, are not especially competitive.
This means a Democrat likely won't take the seat, which will be important since Republicans are expected to control a majority of the House of Representatives by a thin margin. Joe Mario Pedersen, Central Florida Public Media.
The Florida Department of Education released a list of over 700 books that were removed or discontinued from districts throughout the state last school year. That's an increase of almost 400 books from the list they released a year ago for the previous school year. In Central Florida, Volusia County led with 40 books removed, including classics like Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, along with newer favorites like Looking for Alaska by John Green. Florida Freedom to Read Project Director Stefana Farrell calls the list an undercount and says she's worried that even according to DOE data, book bans continue to rise in Florida.
A lot of them removed many books, including classic literature and literature that regularly appears on the AP exams and prepares our students for college-level coursework. We're removing all of these books. In
a statement, the Florida Department of Education says, quote, "There are no books banned in Florida and sexually explicit materials do not belong in schools," end quote. The Orlando Fringe announced this week that it will close down its art space in downtown Orlando in February, citing low turnout and safety concerns. The space, which opened in 2023, will still host its Winterfest this year and several other performances, including The Red String, a new musical, before closing. More local news stories on our website. Visit cfpublic.org. It's been a year since the Seminole Tribe began rolling out sports betting in Florida, and for the only legal sportsbook operator in the state, business is booming.
The expected revenues, I think, is going to be about $13 billion in profits. And the expectation of the betting revenues over the next 10 years in Florida alone is very significant.
A look at the economics of sports betting in the Sunshine State? Check out our website, cfpublic.org. It's been just over 1 month since Hurricane Milton devastated parts of Central Florida with record or near-record amounts of rain. As severe storms bring increasingly more rainfall to Central Florida, flooding remains a top concern. As part of our continued coverage of that flooding with our podcast, Central Florida Seen and Heard Rising Water Part 2, reporter Molly Durig brings us this story about how flooding often creates other concerns, like contamination from wastewater.
That's the sound of me walking through floodwater 4 days after Hurricane Milton hit Central Florida. I'm in Astor, a small, unincorporated community right where Volusia and Lake counties meet, and right along the St. Johns River. On this day, the water in the river is so high, it almost blends into the street.
Go slow! Slow down!
That's Astor resident Rich Williams, trying to get cars to slow down as they plow through the floodwaters, sending small waves rippling all the way up to his garage. Williams says all his flood damage is inside.
The problem we had here was sewage water coming in the house from under the toilets. This is the room that was affected the most.
Williams says in his 13 years of living here, it's the first time he's seen wastewater coming up from below, right into his home. He shows me where it seeped in, from under the toilet.
I found where the water was coming from, and as you can see, I have a test plug in there now to stop the water from coming out.
Mm-hmm. Right? Otherwise it'd be coming right out?
Otherwise it would be flowing out of there.
Here in this pocket of Astor where Williams lives, only about 143 people depend on this wastewater system. The Florida Government Utility Authority owns and operates it. John Nieves with FGUA says Milton's heavy rains flooded the system.
Basically, it was submerged underwater. Anytime that you have the lift station submerged, you're going to have issues with the flow of sewage.
Lift stations, often used to pump wastewater in Florida. You can't rely on gravity alone to move sewage around here, given the state's low elevation.
We know that at some point, almost every lift station is going to fail at some point in its life.
That's Valerie Harwood, a microbiologist and University of South Florida professor who studies sewage. She says there's a reason most lift stations are built near small bodies of water, like retention ponds and creeks.
Although we certainly don't want to chronically release large amounts of sewage, if it has to happen, it's better that it goes into a water body and gets diluted and carried off rather than, going directly into places where people live and work and shop.
Like when raw sewage backed up into the homes in Astor. But under Florida law, Nieves says FGUA didn't need to report it to any higher agency.
That's not considered a contamination. It is, I understand, in a person's home. I mean, obviously it's not sanitary, but it's not it doesn't fall under the DP guidelines where we need to notify them for a contamination.
Sewage spills of more than 1,000 gallons are required to be reported to Florida's Department of Environmental Protection. But issuing a public notice of pollution that's readily available online, that's optional. State legislation requires local governments to evaluate and analyze long-term needs for their wastewater infrastructure to ensure it's resilient to sea level rise. To achieve that resiliency costs a lot of money, ultimately coming from taxpayers. Here's USF professor Valerie Harwood again.
People have a hard time looking at, a several $million-dollar bill to upgrade sewage infrastructure because they're like, my toilet's working fine. Why do we need to spend millions of dollars on this?
Harwood says more public awareness campaigns from regulatory agencies would help. Back in Astor, the permit for the sewer system serving Rich Williams' house will expire next October. Before then, Nieves says FGUA is hoping to break ground on some necessary system upgrades, like elevating a lift station to higher ground. He says that should help prevent future backups. Molly Durig, Central Florida Public Media.
To learn more about flooding in Central Florida, check out our podcast, Central Florida Seen and Heard, Rising Water Part 2, wherever you get this podcast. That's going to do it this week for The Wrap. This podcast is produced by Central Florida Public Media with assistance from News Director LaToya Dennis and Digital Director Ryan Ellison. I'm Brendan Byrne. This is The Wrap.